I've got my popcorn, I've got my iced tea. It's movie night here on Ancient Egypt and the Bible. Okay, a lot of people have asked for a reaction video on Exodus Rediscovered. Exodus Rediscovered is the video that was just put out by Michael Jones, who goes by the name Inspiring Philosophy. Now, this is the first time I've actually seen this video, so you're getting my honest critique and reaction to the video. I am, by education, training, and by vocation, an Egyptologist. So, having studied a lot about Egypt and the Exodus, this is definitely in my wheelhouse. So, let's get into this video, Exodus Rediscovered, and see what it's made of.
Do you believe there was an Exodus?
Yes, I believe there was an
Were
Exodus.
the children of Israel really slaves in Egypt until a series of plagues allowed them to leave and eventually become the nation of Israel? Most Christians and Jews believe this event happened, but many Egyptologists and scholars doubt the story the book of Exodus records.
How many Egyptologists do you
Instead,
know?
Some suggest it was just a myth that was invented by later scribes to give Israel a claim to the land of Canaan and a reason to motivate a return from their later exile in Babylon.
That may be more
Many
of a biblical
archaeologists
studies opinion.
also say we have little to no evidence that would support an exodus from Egypt during the Late Bronze Age. So until we find evidence,
that's
there is no
depend on
reason
who
to
you
assume
ask.
it happened. But perhaps the reason we cannot find it is because we've been looking for it in the wrong time period.
Okay. Anytime somebody says we don't find evidence of the Exodus because we're looking in the wrong period, that raises a red flag right there. Now, there could be something to that. However, most of the time, they're just ignoring the evidence that's already there and, say, looking in green, trying to find more evidence in greener pastures. It's just a really bad way to start a video like this. Because it's just almost become a cliche. Oh, you don't find the Exodus because it's in another time frame.
Turmoil, acts of desperation, a drastic change in Egyptian policy, and peculiar animal graves. There is a lesser-known pharaoh that had several anomalies correlate with his reign that surprisingly fit very well with an exodus of Semites from Egypt.
Oh, really?
The story of the Exodus is as follows. After Joseph died, at some point a new pharaoh came to power, who did not know about Joseph. He and his dynasty enslaved the Hebrews, and forced them to make bricks and construct buildings. Specifically, they built store cities called Pithom and Ramesses. As time went on, the Hebrews grew in size. To deal with the growing population, the Egyptians threw the male infants of the Hebrews into the Nile. One woman saved her son by placing him in a reed basket and floating him down the Nile, where he was discovered by Pharaoh's daughter. He was named Moses and raised by the Pharaoh's daughter with the royal family. When he grew up, he was troubled by his people in slavery. But after killing an Egyptian who was beating a Hebrew, he had to flee to Arabia. But many years later, after all who wanted him dead had passed away, it is said that God appeared to him and commissioned him to go back to Egypt to lead the Hebrews out of slavery. But the Pharaoh at that time was stubborn and prideful. He refused to let the Hebrews leave. So God sent plagues upon Egypt to not only punish the Egyptians, but to demonstrate his power over the Egyptian gods. After the 10th plague, which is when all of the firstborn of Egypt were struck down, including the Pharaoh's own son, the Hebrews were allowed to leave. But the pharaoh soon changed his mind and led an army to retrieve the Hebrews and bring them back to Egypt. At the edge of the Red Sea, the pharaoh caught up to the Hebrews, but God sent a strong east wind to blow the sea back all night, opening a path for the Hebrews to cross to the other side. The Egyptian army pursued them, but once all the Hebrews crossed, God allowed the winds to die, and the waters came back, destroying the army and all their chariots. Thus Israel's exodus from Egypt had been fulfilled, as God promised. So what we can look for in the Egyptian archaeological record is a time when there were foreign Semitic slaves in Egypt, around the site known as Ramesses, which was suddenly abandoned. This would most likely have caused a sudden need for a new slave labor force in Egypt, as well as possibly a demand for new chariots. The plagues would likely have caused a decline in Egyptian power and their military might, as well as potential religious turmoil, given that scholars note the plagues were meant to also be judgment on the Egyptian gods. Evidence should also reveal that the pharaoh at the time was considered merciless, prideful, and arrogant, and whoever succeeded him could not have been his oldest son. So if it exists, this should be sufficient evidence to match what the book of Exodus says, and support the historical reality of the Exodus. Most scholars who believe the Exodus is an historical event suggest it happened under Ramesses II, given that Exodus mentions the city Ramesses. We know where this city is, and we know it was most likely not called Ramesses until the 19th dynasty. However, referring to this site as Ramesses could just be
calling that's a little strange right there. You know, where he says that it could have been called something else until the city was named Ramses. No. That's suspect right there. But let's see what else he adds to this.
An updated place name, like how it is used in Genesis, and how there are also other updated place names.
He's confusing retrojection and redaction. These are very, very different things. The use of Ramses in Genesis is a retrojection. It's writing for a current audience back in time. Now, it is possible that it's references to Ramses in, say, Exodus could have been retrojection. That's always a possibility. The problem with viewing it as retrojection is the other cultural evidence involved. So there's that issue. But what he's talking about here, where it's a later redaction of the text, is he's basically saying that the names were changed later on. So we have to keep in mind that there are two different concepts at play here. And they are not the same in Genesis versus Exodus.
Plus, not many of the correlations we should expect to find show up under Ramesses, or at all during the 19th dynasty. But we can find a much better match at an earlier date, under a different pharaoh. Now the Bible says the Exodus happened 480 years before Solomon began constructing the temple.
Yeah, that 480 years is highly contestable, given the genre of the passage. The fact is that 480 could be a way of a form of numerology that was often used in temple dedication inscriptions, which 1 Kings 6:1 definitely was.
This estimate comes from the late Masoretic texts. The Greek Septuagint says it was 440 years. Either way, this would place the Exodus around the 15th century BC, long before Ramesses II. Scholars note the Hebrews tended to use idealized numbers to mark things. As Christine Hayes once said, the Hebrews liked round numbers. So this is probably a general estimate of when the Exodus happened.
It's also the fact that anything that was a multiple of 40 was often signified a long period of time. This is a common euphemism in the ancient Near East. It's used in Egypt. It's used in Moab. And invariably, it's also used in the Bible.
It doesn't necessarily have to be exactly 480 or 440 years before Solomon's temple. But given that Judges 11 says that during the time of Jephthah, Israel had already been in the land of Canaan for about 300.
As if we would believe anything Jephthah says. You know, he gets everything in that passage wrong. In fact, the whole point of that passage was to show that being the son of a harlot, Jephthah was completely ignorant. He gets the name of the god wrong. He gets the name of who provided the land wrong. He gets everything in that passage wrong. I don't think we can take Jephthah as a credible witness of anything. And that's the point. He's not a credible witness.
Years. Both are probably just general estimates for when the Exodus happened, instead of it being entirely irrelevant for dating the Exodus. But getting an exact date is unlikely to happen. This is also compounded by the fact that Egyptian chronology is not set in stone, and Egyptologists still debate within a few decades about when certain pharaohs began to reign.
Within a few decades is... wow. Within maybe a decade or two. And that's being overly generous here. For the Late New Kingdom, the dating is probably within plus or minus 7 years. So you're talking at most a 14-year span. You know, so that's really what we're talking about here. We're not talking about great long spans of time here. And some of the dates are more exact than others, so we can't even broadly say that chronology is going to be off by, say, 20 years for the entire New Kingdom, because there's points in the New Kingdom where the dating is very precise, and then there's points where it's less precise.
Reign. Most either hold a high chronology or low chronology.
Almost nobody holds a high chronology these days. Nobody does. It just can't be supported by the evidence. I don't know any chronologists of any worth who actually have studied chronology in any detail that still hold to a high chronology. It's just a theory that's outlived its time. Almost everybody is either a low or what was sometimes called a low middle chronology for those who really want to sort of press the dates a little further. But nobody believes in a high chronology anymore. It's just a out of date scholarship.
But even within that, dates are still debatable by a few decades or so.
Yeah, I love how he says these dates are debatable by a few decades or so. I did a video once talking about the difference in chronology between doubt and error. You know, error being what happens when you do everything right and there's still a little bit of debate because of inaccuracies in the process. Doubt is when you just sort of heap doubt without reason onto it. The or so, that's sowing doubt. That's not actually talking about error in chronology.
I say all this to note that there is some wiggle room when it comes to biblical and Egyptian chronology.
Gotta love that wiggle room.
So we don't have to worry about exact dating.
Well, we don't have to worry about exact dating, but you are going to have to worry about relative dating. Because even if you can't nail it to an exact year, relative dating is going to influence absolute dating. And that's going to be the real rub here. Because a lot of what, say, early daters want to do is going to try to superimpose that wiggle room on absolute dating to affect relative dating. And you can't do that. That just can't be done.
But should instead focus on the general time period. But what should primarily concern us is the evidence itself. If there was more or better evidence for an exodus in another time period, that should be our primary witness. And biblical dates should be secondary to this, since scholars have shown that biblical numbers can be idealized instead of exact dates or quantities. However, we can start with the general estimate given by the biblical text and see what we find. Also, there are other cases for the Exodus in later and earlier time periods. But for the purpose of this documentary, I won't have time to cover them in depth, and instead, I'll focus on the case I'm presenting. So, this would mean the Exodus likely took place during the 18th dynasty of Egypt, and the political situation in Egypt correlates well with the biblical record.
No.
First, the events that lead up to the Exodus match well with the political changes in Egypt at this time. To recap, remember in previous videos, we have noted the life of Abraham and the destruction of Sodom and Gomorrah align with the Middle Bronze Age too. This then places Joseph in the second intermediate period, when
That's
the
correct.
Hyksos, or 15th dynasty, ruled Egypt.
Yep.
Now notice
That's
what
correct.
Exodus 1 begins with. It says a new pharaoh came to power who did not know about Joseph. This can fit with the political changes at the end of the second intermediate period, when the native
no problem there.
Egyptians took back control of Egypt and kicked out the foreign Hyksos rulers. The new 18th dynasty of Egypt despised the Hyksos and tried to wipe them out of history. And they were pretty successful in removing the records of their accomplishments and acts. But furthermore, they would not have cared if the Hyksos saved...
The whole fact that we don't have records for the Hyksos doesn't have much to do with them being wiped out by the later 18th dynasty. No, that's not a lot of what's going on there. The fact is that any monuments that the Hyksos would have had would have been just simply destroyed by the archaeological context, the environment. Avaris was a very wet city. It was in the delta. Very little actually survived the delta. So, and it's not as if the Hyksos made it down to Thebes to build at Karnak. So, they didn't have monuments in dry places. So, I don't think we can really say here that the memory of the Hyksos was destroyed by the 18th dynasty. You do get some, say, political statements later on saying that, like Hatshepsut claims to have driven out the Hyksos, and, well, she didn't do it personally. Okay, but that's more of a rhetorical flourish at that point than any actual real conquest. And also, we just don't find evidence of their name being obliterated. It's not like, say, what we find with Atenism, where Akhenaten, chips out the names of competing gods. We don't find that with the Hyksos. So this is definitely an exaggeration of the facts.
Egypt through years of famine. They considered the Hyksos to be an embarrassment on the Egyptian legacy.
An embarrassment? I think that's an overstatement. They weren't anything at all at that point.
Also, Exodus says the Egyptians were worried the Semitic Hebrews might join with their enemies. If the 18th dynasty had just kicked out the Semitic Hyksos, it would make sense they would worry that the Semites they had just seized power over might join with the Hyksos to regain control of Egypt.
I'm sorry. Okay, I'm going to try to get composure here. The 18th dynasty worrying that the Israelites were going to rejoin with the Hyksos to take over Egypt was not a concern. That's just ridiculous beyond all imagining. First of all, Jones doesn't actually understand what the Hyksos were. The Hyksos were... The word Hyksos comes from an Egyptian word that means foreign rulers. The Hyksos were the rulers of an Amoritic Semitic population that had entered into Egypt during the first intermediate period. The fact is that by the 18th dynasty, the rulers were driven out. There was no possibility that they were returning. So the idea that they were going to join with the Hyksos to retake Egypt was just ridiculous. There's a lot better explanation to the fact that the Israelites might ally with Egypt's enemies, which was the war Egypt had with the Hittites in the 19th dynasty, at the end of the 18th, beginning of the 19th dynasty. There was actually a state of war that happened for 50 years in Egypt, from essentially the reign of Ai until the reign of Ramses II. That's a much, much better explanation of the Israelites joining with Egypt's enemies. But the Hyksos? No. The Hyksos had been soundly defeated. There was not even a hint of threat that the Hyksos were going to return from the dead and attack Egypt to conquer it. No, this is just patently ridiculous.
The fears of the Egyptians that the Book of Exodus mentions seems to fit with the rise of the new 18th dynasty, trying to maintain control over their new kingdom and worrying about a possible counterattack from Semitic people.
They had control. They didn't have to worry about it. They had conquered it pretty thoroughly. At this point, they were more in a expansionist mode. I mean, really, after Thutmose and Amenhotep I, there was really no question that the tone of Egyptian hegemony had changed.
Next, the Book of Exodus also notes the Egyptians worried the Hebrews were increasing too much in numbers. This fits well with the cultural context of the time period. The common belief was the Hyksos takeover of Egypt was a sudden invasion from the north. But the archaeological record suggests the Hyksos were in Egypt long before the start of their dynasty, and their takeover may have been a gradual shift due to changes in population sizes.
Yeah, I don't think so. I don't think this had to do with changes in population size. I think the shift in power had to do more with the fact that the 13th dynasty had lost control. The 13th dynasty really had a hard time hanging on to things. It had many short-lived rulers. I mean, it was very uncommon for a 13th dynasty king to reign even 10 years. And we don't know exactly the reason why that was, but they just couldn't seem to hang on to power. And it looks a lot more like the Hyksos just filled a vacuum. I don't think this really had anything to do with population size. The population of Avars at the beginning of, or at the end of the 13th dynasty was still relatively small. Not large enough to really pose a threat.
Throughout the Middle Kingdom, we have evidence of Asiatics moving into and settling in Egypt. Over time, they seem to have just become the dominant power in Lower Egypt and took over. Manfred Bietek suggests the Hyksos should be understood within a repetitive pattern of the attraction of Egypt for Western Asiatic population groups that came in search of a living in the country, especially the Delta, since prehistoric times. Now let's fast forward back to the rise of the New Kingdom, when the native Egyptians regained control of Egypt. It would make sense, as Exodus records, that they would worry about history repeating itself, and Asiatic peoples living in Egypt overpopulating and taking control again. So forcing the Hebrews into slavery and hard living conditions, as well as trying to keep their population in check, would also make sense with this time period. Also, around this time, we have a depiction on the Tomb of Reichmere, which shows foreign...
Not Reichmere, Reichmere. Reichmere. Please get the names right.
Slaves involved in brickmaking. Later texts also make reference to slaves being used in making bricks. So slaves working as brickmakers, as Exodus records, also fits with the time period of the 18th dynasty.
Semites being used as brickmakers goes way back. It's not something that's unique to the 18th dynasty. You know, we have reports in the 19th dynasty. It would have been even down into the Old Kingdom. We have reports of this. So this is not something that's exclusive to Dynasty 18. Here's the thing. Brickmaking was considered to be a specialized trade. Egyptians didn't typically do it on a mass scale. They weren't efficient at it. So slaves, especially foreign slaves, were often used for this purpose. And part of this comes from the fact that we don't understand, a lot of people don't understand the nature of slavery in Egypt, which was to fill in for, let's just say, trades that required specialized knowledge. So a lot of slaves were like fig knockers, vintners, metalsmiths, artisans. So these were specialized trades that Egypt imported to make life better.
We see what the Bible records as to what led up to the Exodus fits well with the fall of the Hyksos and the rise of the 18th dynasty. Now, the first part of the 18th dynasty was massively successful, with multiple campaigns into Canaan and Nubia. Massive building.
Nubia and Canaan have been invaded off and on since the Middle Kingdom. This was just part of Egyptian hegemony. This is how they buoyed up 3,000 years of inflation. It was a way to make their economy more secure.
Projects were also conducted, and there was an expansion of Egypt's power and wealth. One of the richest pharaohs who ever lived reigned during this time period, Thutmose III.
All right, it's not Thutmose, it's Tut-mo-se, or Tut-mo-sis. Okay? If you go with the Greek, it's Tut-mo-se. If you go with the Egyptian, it's Tut-mo-sis. It's not Thutmose, under any circumstance.
He also had one of the longest reigns, when on multiple campaigns expanded Egypt's territory.
Yes, it was a very long reign.
And utilized slave labor in several building projects. He was also one of the greatest contributors to the arts and monuments in Egyptian history. Egypt under Thutmose III reached one of its highest points ever.
That's going to get really annoying.
But all that ended within a decade, once his son took the throne, Amenhotep II. Egyptologists...
Well, no, it's not going to come to an end with Amenhotep II. Amenhotep II is actually going to continue this.
Notes several anomalies with regard to his reign that individually don't amount to much, but combined, they line up with the circumstantial evidence we should expect to find if there was an exodus from Egypt.
There's a problem with circumstantial evidence for a reason.
One of the biggest anomalies is about 10 years into his reign, he broke from his father's warlike policy, as well as his own, and the evidence suggests he signed a peace treaty with one of his biggest rivals, the Mitanni Empire, and he also sought peace with...
That is true that Amenhotep II did sign a peace treaty with the Mitanni. That's correct. And that was after his year 9 campaign into the Levant.
The surrounding nations. The reason why this is odd is because the previous policies of the 18th dynasty were mostly conquest and war.
It's a little more complicated than that. The policies of Thutmosis III was not just conquest and war. Now, it is true that Thutmosis III really, really liked war. He really shunned the vagaries of court life. Court life had not treated Thutmosis III well. It was court life that essentially made him a second-class citizen in his own kingdom, putting his stepmother Hatshepsut on the throne. The last thing, and in this process, Thutmosis III developed just a rabid hatred of court life. So he was much happier on the battlefield. Now, with that said, Thutmosis, even though he was often on campaign, limited his expansion up to the Orontes. And one of the things we have to understand about the later conquests of Amenhotep II is he's really more or less following in his father's footsteps, also going up only as far as the Orontes. It just seems that after the Orontes, the Egyptians didn't have any interest beyond that sort of landmark. The Egyptian Empire wasn't much of an empire. It wasn't expansionist. It never was like that. It always sort of wanted territories that it could easily control, easily go and reconquer if needed. So it tried to keep its land possessions, its hegemonic possessions, closer to home. Which is why they always, conquered Kush, and they always conquered the Levant. Because those were relatively close to home. They could set up administrative centers and control those regions with a fairly rapid response time if they needed.
Thutmose III expanded Egypt's territory through vassal kingdoms and campaigned deep into Mitanni territory.
Yes, but that's because the Mitannis were at that point pretty weak and Thutmose III could really easily do it.
Clashing with them time and time again. Amenhotep appears to have wanted to continue this policy during the first part of his reign. One of his campaigns was most likely launched after the death of his father. He put down rebellions in Canaan and antagonized the Mitanni Empire. Some scholars suggest the primary aim of this campaign was the conquest of Mitanni itself. Peter Dermanurian
I don't think
says,
so.
Despite Thutmose III's military success, Mitanni remained Egypt's primary adversary in Dynasty 18, and there is no reason to doubt her continued aggressive policy in the reign of the young king, Amenhotep II. However, during Amenhotep's first campaign, putting down rebellions in Canaan and maintaining...
I don't think any Egyptian ever thought that they could conquer Mitanni. I mean, it's just too far. Even Thutmose III got as much as he wanted and then quit. He could have gone further beyond the Orontes. There was no question that he had the military capability to do it. I just don't think he had the interest. He got what he wanted and he was going home.
Maintaining power there seemed to take up most of their efforts, preventing any further engagements with Mitanni. Amenhotep also displayed his warlike nature early in his reign. Mashe Munich says that Amenhotep adopted a violent war god called Reshef into the pantheon and praised him for helping him with his campaigns.
Alright, Reshef is a Canaanite deity. It was worshipped at Avaris. We've got lots of archaeological evidence to this effect. So, Amenhotep II was probably just adopting the deities that had already been in common worship at Avaris. So that wasn't unusual. The pharaohs of the 18th dynasty often did this. For example, we have Horemheb creating a plinth for the god Baal, for example.
He says, undoubtedly, from the point of view of Amenhotep II's court, the most important characteristic of Reshef was the warlike spirit of the Syrian deity. Such a god...
Yeah, but Egypt already had vicious warlike gods. Reshef is no different than, say, Montu.
God was a proper guardian of military campaigns of the young, impetuous pharaoh. Reshef is depicted as a menacing deity able to send death. Amenhotep II boasts of crossing the Orontes with his army, like Reshef. Gary Shaw adds that Amenhotep also likened himself to the Egyptian war god Montu. So it appears Amenhotep was quite bloodthirsty and wanted to be like his father.
No, they all adopted war gods. This is part of being pharaoh, was being competent at war. That was just showing that you could protect the land. You could protect the land from, say, the 9 bows, the 9 traditional enemies of Egypt. That you could maintain the supply of food. This was an important consideration for being king. There's nothing particularly warlike about that, or bloodthirsty about that. That was just what kings did back then.
In carrying out war and conquest. This is also consistent with his overall character. Scholars routinely note Amenhotep was very arrogant and boastful. Donald Redford speaks of his bombast and braggart nature. Gary Shaw notes he bragged about his own athletic abilities. James Pritchard says Amenhotep II gloried in his reputation for personal strength and prowess. His record...
Yes, he did brag about his strength and prowess, particularly with bow. He was apparently a marksman archer, and it was a very well-known feat. Now, all kings had to brag about their physical prowess to some extent. This is why we have the Hebsed festival. After 30 years of a reign, a king has to prove he's still got vigor and physical prowess, because that was part of the job.
Therefore contrast with those of his predecessor and father, Thutmose III, and emphasizing individual achievement.
Well, it's also true that Amenhotep II came to the throne relatively young. I mean, he was 18 when he ascended the throne. So the fact is that as an 18-year-old, you're in the prime of your life, you have all your strength. And as a 18-year-old king, you're going to prove that strength on the battlefield whenever you can.
Other scholars observe, Amenhotep, more than any other pharaoh, set up monuments to glorify his personal valor, passing over, however, some of the major but less complimentary events of his campaigns, especially his defeats.
Well, any king on monuments passed over their defeat. That's nothing unusual, because monuments were meant to be perpetual offerings to the gods. You gave your victories to the gods so that they would be repeated over and over again as a form of worship. Just like in Israelite culture, you don't give the spotted lamb. You give the perfect lamb. The Egyptians were no different in this respect. They gave perfect victories. They didn't give, defeats.
So what we have is a very arrogant and prideful pharaoh who wanted to boast of his prowess and warlike nature. Egyptian pharaohs were pretty arrogant as it was, but Egyptologists often note that Amenhotep stood out as extremely arrogant.
I don't know if that's a universal statement across Egyptologists. I don't think you'll find any Egyptologist that notes, across the board. I don't think you would have that opinion. That's something you just don't find in the field. I think he's overstating this.
And more so than the other rulers.
No, not more so than the other rulers. There was rulers that bragged a lot more than Amenhotep II. This is just silly talk.
Now, not only does this fit with the description of the pharaoh Moses would have been dealing with, but it also seems to be a complete reversal of the policies Amenhotep pursued later during his reign. If his initial goals were conquest and glorifying his personal valor, and if his father set him up with one of Egypt's richest and most powerful time periods, why completely reverse this and pursue peace with your biggest enemy.
Money. That's why. There's a Ferengi rule of acquisition. War is good for profit. Peace is good for profit. That's why he pursued peace with Mitanni. And you know what? Amenhotep III did the same thing. He also pursued peace with the Mitanni, just so he could inculcate trade. Because trade is good for profit.
Donald Redford also notes, the way the Egyptian inscriptions word these peace talks suggests this was something out of place. The amplification of the stock phrases that opened the pericope, together with the insistence that this was a unique event, suggest.
Unfortunately, Redford's book is at this point badly dated. It came out at a time just before we made some very key discoveries in Egypt and in the Levant. Yeah, it still has some value, but it's nowadays it's a badly dated book. It's not something I would really depend upon for, say, opinions such as this. And a lot of Redford's opinions have come back to haunt him with this book, so I don't think it's a great source.
That a certain kernel of truth is concealed beneath the hyperbole. Amanda Padani says, in a dramatic transformation, his reign became remarkably peaceful, notable for the many buildings he constructed. He seems to have agreed to a peace treaty with Mitanni, surprising though that may seem.
The Mitanni also later come and ask for military assistance from Amenhotep II. So there is some evidence that's come out recently that seems to suggest that Amenhotep II still had a very viable army years after his Year 9 conquest and eventual peace treaty with Mitanni.
Given the history of hostilities between the two lands. Gary Shaw says, it is unclear why relations suddenly improved between Egypt and each of these great powers. The rationale for the treaty when it comes to Mitanni makes sense. The Hittites were growing in size and becoming a threat to Mitanni.
That's true. The Hittites were growing and becoming a threat to Mitanni.
Securing Egypt as an ally would help protect against this. But Redford notes the rationale for Egypt signing a treaty is a little less clear. There is no doubt that Egypt's own interests would have been served by such a treaty, although the pharaonic state of the 18th dynasty could more easily than Mitanni sustain the expense of periodic military incursions 800 kilometers into Asia. In other words, Egypt was not really threatened by the Hittites, given how much further they were and the terrain the Hittites would have had to cross. Plus, as we have noted, Thutmose III gave Egypt one of its richest and most successful periods. There is no reason to fear invasion from the east, given their military might and geographical location.
Well, just because you don't fear someone militarily doesn't mean you don't want to trade with them. There's always room for more money. I don't think I've encountered a single billionaire in my life who didn't think more money was better.
And Amenhotep's initial motives seem to have been the opposite of pursuing peace. Gary Shaw says, we cannot know if making peace.
Well, every early king in Egypt has to rattle the saber. That's just every king in Egypt has that. And almost every king begins their reign with one or two conquests. You just have to show all the little local chieftains who's the boss. And we find that consistently through the reigns of most of the kings of Egypt, especially in the kingdom periods. So that doesn't seem to bear out.
Peace with the Hittites, Mitanni, and the Babylonians was the aim of Amenhotep's, or something that he accepted begrudgingly as a political necessity. By making treaties, he would now have to accept these former enemies as brothers, an admission of equality that would seem out of character for Amenhotep. Nonetheless, If it is accepted that these treaties date to Amenhotep's reign, they are the first that the Egyptians ever entered into with foreign states. A more likely thing for Egypt to have done, at the height of its empire, would have been to take Mitanni on as a vassal, in exchange...
Take Mitanni on as a vassal? Mitanni was a big empire. Egypt did not have the resources to control Mitanni. We know that the way that Egypt controlled the Levant was by setting up a small garrison towns. These small garrison towns usually had less than 1,000 people in them. They were not meant to control vast empires. They were more or less there to keep small vassal states in check. I don't think that that's the idea of Egypt, making Mitanni a vassal is realistic. I think that's a kind of silly proposition.
For protection against the Hittites. Egypt had already been pursuing a policy in Canaan of ruling through vassal kingdoms. If Mitanni needed protection, this seems like a sensible thing to do. In other words, it's hard to see what Egypt gained from this treaty. The Egyptian inscriptions
well, it's easy to see what Egypt gained from a treaty with the Mitanni. They no longer had to fight over the cities on the Orontes. That's really what it was about. Mitanni would no longer do incursions into the Levant, down in Syria and into Canaan. Having that secured meant that Egypt could focus on, say, other endeavors, like Kush. So, I just don't think that... I think there's other alternatives, other reasons why Egypt would want a treaty with the Mitanni, other than just war or vassal states. That's just sterile conjecture.
You speak of the other nations coming and paying tribute to Amenhotep, but Egyptologists see this as propaganda to help make Amenhotep look greater than he was. The evidence suggests a treaty was signed between these great nations, not Mitanni and the other nations becoming vassals or accepting the rulership of Egypt.
Again, so
treaties imply that both sides need peace and protection. Becoming a vast...
No. Treaties do not imply that both sides need protection. Treaties imply that you've come to agreement to cease hostilities. That's not the same thing. Now, there can be mutual protection clauses in treaties. There's no doubt about that. But it doesn't have to be that.
Is what tended to happen when only one side needed peace and protection. And there is no evidence Mitanni, the Nubians, or the Hittites were threatening to invade Egypt anytime soon. Another explanation is Egypt may have experienced some sort of internal calamity that caused us...
Yeah, Jones here seems to be going to a lot of explanations why this would fit. That's not evidence. That's confirmation bias. I think that so far this has been very problematic in that respect. He's got a theory and he's looking for a justification. So there are other reasons that could just as easily satisfy what evidence there is. But it doesn't have to be what Jones suggests.
Sudden decrease in power and wealth, causing them to necessarily seek peace with their biggest rivals, instead of continuing to wage costly wars against them. Egypt seems to have been severely weakened, which caused Amenhotep to change his mentality and pursue a...
Yeah, there's no evidence that Egypt was weakened during the reign of Amenhotep II. Just no evidence for this.
Policy of peace, which would correlate with the idea the Exodus took place during this time period. Egypt was afflicted by plagues and lost a massive workforce, forcing them to change their policy from war and conquest to peace. Claude van der Sluwen even admits, it seems possible to consider this reign as unsuccessful, a time of decline, a few exploits abroad, a few preserved memorials, an almost complete absence of sources after the 9th year of his reign.
Yeah, I think that's an overstatement.
This is also supported by one of the Amarna letters, which suggests Egypt had become much weaker in this time period. Letter 109 reads, "Previously, on seeing a man from Egypt, the kings of Canaan fled before him, but now the sons of Abdi of Sirta make the men of Egypt prowl about like dogs. Death would be sweet to me."
Oh, that is so wrong. Okay. The whole Abdi Tirsha incident is not that Egypt was weakened. It's that Akhenaten picked and chose what conquests he did in the Levant. Now, we're discovering now that, say, the Amarna period was not as weak as many people think. In fact, we do actually have conquest records for the reign of Akhenaten. We have this big conquest wall at, for example, Karnak. So even early on in Akhenaten's reign, he's doing conquests into Levant. Now, in the later period when Akhenaten moves to Amarna, Akhenaten is a lot more interested in his new cult. He's a lot more interested in Atenism than he is in conquest. Which is why he sort of refrains. He's able to. In fact, you can't have a completely new religion in Egypt without a very strong military to back you up. And during the Amarna period, the military was really strong. In fact, it's so strong that after the death of, say, King Tut, the Egyptians feel confident picking a war with the Hittites. And a war that lasts for 50 years. So Egypt had a very, very strong military during the Amarna period. So I don't think we can take the Amarna letter 109 as evidence that the military strength of Egypt had weakened. In fact, the evidence suggests quite the opposite.
Van der Sluwen notes after Amenhotep II, Egypt went through a period of military inertness that lasted up until the time of Horemheb. There were a few campaigns.
Horemheb was a general during the Amarna period. He was a general during the reign of King Akhenaten. Okay? So, no, this is wrong.
Under Thutmose IV. But these do not seem to be conquests, but mere policing operations in Canaan and one raid into Nubia.
Well, the difference between conquest and police action is very, very slim. The fact is that a lot of police actions were just maintaining the conquest that had already been done by Thutmosis III. So, the whole idea of new conquests, through, say, the imperial period of the New Kingdom is a bit dodgy. We call them conquests because they are going from town to town, breaking skulls. But they are almost all policing actions anyway. A lot of them, again, take place at the beginning of reigns to establish the new kid on the throne to ensure the perpetuity of the kingdom.
Gary Shaw says that the 18th dynasty empire building phase was over, and the great battles had dried up. Pritchard notes, some of the places that Thutmose IV claimed to have conquered were already in the list of Amenhotep II and Thutmose III, so he was most likely exaggerating in speaking of places he conquered.
It's probably more speaking about places he went on campaign, not necessarily conquered. Okay? There's again a fine difference there. A lot of kings went on campaign. Very few actually conquered. Thutmose III conquered. Amenhotep II went on campaign.
Peter Clayton also notes about these campaigns, is that they may have been rather low-key policing excursions rather than full-blown military attacks.
A distinction without a difference.
There is little evidence to suggest Egypt remained as strong as it was militarily, like it was when Thutmose III was alive. And the drastic change seems to have happened under Amenhotep II.
Yeah, that's going to be really difficult to prove.
Without a clear explanation as to why.
Yeah, this is starting to bother me too, where Jones repeatedly says without a clear explanation why. Egyptians did not put clear explanations about anything. So that is more or less just seeding a negative evidence argument. So I hope he doesn't go there, but it just seems that he's seeding that argument.
However, if Egypt experienced devastating plagues...
All right. If Egypt experienced devastating plagues, you're going to have to show that Egypt experienced devastating plagues. Otherwise, you're just creating a circular argument.
The loss of a large slave workforce and a portion of their army drowned in the Red Sea. This would explain the sudden political changes and the military weakening.
That would be a sufficient explanation, but not a necessary explanation. Again, you'd have to show that. Otherwise, you're just creating a logical fallacy here. If this had happened, then this is what happened. That's a logical fallacy.
There is also evidence to support this in the last campaign launched by Amenhotep II. One stele records that Amenhotep had a 3rd-year campaign. Another records that he had a 7th-year campaign and a 9th-year campaign. A problem arises because the 2nd stele records that the 7th-year campaign was his first victorious campaign. There are numerous proposed solutions to this. Some scholars seem to imply the 2nd stele just have a mistake, and he really had 3 campaigns. Albrecht Alt suggested the 3rd-year campaign was actually one of Thutmose III's campaigns, and Amenhotep was still a co-regent. Shamel Yavin believes it wasn't really a campaign, but just a local disturbance. James Pritchard suggests the 7th year and the 3rd year campaign are really the same event. One just counts from when Amenhotep began reigning as a co-regent with his father, and the second counts from when he was the sole ruler. Claude van der Sluijn and Douglas Petrovich.
Oh, those are names that you just should not have on a video like this if you want to be seen as credible.
Point out the 2nd stele are 19th dynasty restorations, and they may have just written the wrong year.
That is real. Egyptians did not restore stela in that way to correct it. They didn't redact stela. That's just silliest.
In other words, there really was no 7th year campaign.
Yeah, I've got my doubts about that.
These solutions are fine. I tend to favor the 2-campaign hypothesis of either Pritchard or van der Sluijn, but it is not a hill worth dying on. Nonetheless, for the purposes of this documentary, I'll refer to his 3rd year campaign and the 7th year campaign as one and the same as his 1st campaign, and the 9th year campaign as his 2nd. Now, the 1st campaign was launched in the spring, which was typical of most Egyptian campaigns. Der Manulian notes this was the usual time for conquest to be launched. Amenhotep II put down rebellions and antagonized the Mitanni Empire. The 2nd campaign during his 9th year is unusual. First, it was launched in the fall. Pritchard notes this is an unusual season for an Egyptian campaign into Asia. Fall was a bad time for Egypt to be launching a campaign, because it meant you'd be fighting through the cold and rainy winter. You would only do this if it was absolutely necessary. Van der Sluijn says, the 2nd Asiatic campaign began on the 25th day of the 3rd month of the 9th year, during an unusual season for military campaigns. It was probably induced by the necessity of urgent intervention. The second oddity of this campaign is they did not go far. They stayed south of the Sea of Galilee in territories that Egypt already had control over. And finally, and most importantly, the primary purpose of this campaign seems to have been taking captives back to serve as slaves. Egypt, for some odd reason, needed a bunch of additional new slaves.
Egypt always needed new slaves. So I don't see where a compelling need to go break some town walls and take some people back is anything particularly provocative. They always did this.
The amount of the captives they took is vastly larger to what we see in previous campaigns.
Not larger than what was claimed by Senefru. Senefru claimed a lot of slaves. A lot more than that.
He claims he brought back over 100,000 prisoners of war. In his previous campaign, he only brought back around 2,000 prisoners. In the prior campaigns of Thutmosis III, we also see far less.
Again, why did he need the slaves? Was he building monuments? Did he need a lot of manual labor? Did he need a lot of skilled labor? It depends. He's not... Amenhotep II isn't the first person in Egyptian history to do this, and he wasn't the last.
That what Amenhotep brought back in his 9th year. Most scholars believe the 100,000 is an exaggeration, but a more conservative estimate still would place the amount at a much higher level than what we see in previous campaigns. Also peculiar, a secondary purpose of this campaign seems to have been obtaining new chariots and weapons. The inscription records he brought back 1,000 new chariots and over 13,000 weapons of war.
Okay. The whole idea of bringing back chariots is something that's an issue. Oftentimes, they did not bring back whole chariots. They would bring, the crossbeams. And the reason why they brought back the crossbeams is because they could be repurposed. The problem with Levantine chariots is that they were unsuitable for use in the desert warfare. So the whole idea that Amenhotep II is bringing back chariots for use in Egypt is kind of ridiculous. I don't think that's very viable.
So to recap, Amenhotep launched the campaign at an unusual time in the fall, which Vandersloot notes suggests a sense of desperation. They didn't attack rival empires like before, but stayed close to Egypt's main border, and their goal seems to have been gaining a new slave workforce, new chariots, and weapons. Remember something important. The book of Exodus says Israel left Egypt in the spring. So if the Exodus happened earlier that same year, and Egypt lost an entire slave labor force, as well as several chariots in the Red Sea, this 9th year campaign in the fall would fit right in and explain why Amenhotep desperately needed to gather new slaves and new chariots.
That's just hypothetical fallacy.
If an exodus didn't happen earlier that year, you would think that gathering extra weapons and chariots, as well as a new slave workforce that would free up native Egyptians to serve in the army, would be a reason to launch more campaigns northeast against Mitanni or the Hittite Empire. However, as we noted, the exact opposite happened. Amenhotep, the warmongering king who worshipped the violent war gods Reshef and Montu, decided to seek peace with his biggest rivals.
Look, there was a lot easier way to get new chariots than to go on campaign, honestly. During the early 18th dynasty, Egypt had a colony at Byblos. They could have just gone to Byblos, got more wood, and shipped it back. So this is just... that would be a lot easier way to make new chariots than to go spend military resources to take it.
And treated them like equals. Plus, as we also see, Egypt entered a time of military inertness and weakened after this.
Again, debatable. In fact, it's not even debatable. It's the evidence doesn't support that.
However, seeking peace, military inertness, needing new slaves and chariots would be what we would expect if an exodus took place and the country was devastated by plagues.
This is classic confirmation bias.
But there's still more to look at. You would think that if an exodus didn't happen, this would be a time for celebration in Egypt. Thutmose III had delivered a golden age. Amenhotep had just returned with thousands of new captives to serve Egypt. The Egyptian gods should be celebrated for this.
Exactly how many monuments from Amenhotep II survived? Here's the answer. Not many. We don't know what the state of the country was. So, again, we're getting into sterile conjecture.
Time of abundance. However, we see the exact opposite. Gary Shaw notes an anomaly of one inscription of Amenhotep II. It reads, "His person commands to his august ones, the officials of the royal court, the courtiers who can enter the palace, the servants of the good God, to destroy all the images of the gods, their bodies, Amun-Ra." Shaw notes this act of destroying the statues and images of the gods does not have a satisfactory explanation. The reference to destroying the images of the gods has not been satisfactorily explained. It seems that Amenhotep needed to act judgment on his own gods, even after they had brought Egypt.
Maybe, maybe not. Depends whose gods they were, what temple it was, depends what the context was. Where did this happen? Without proper context, that's very, very difficult to make those conclusions.
So much wealth and power. He suggests it may refer to the act of fashioning new cult images. But Douglas Petrovich points out that what Egyptologists fail to explain candidly is that it would seem impossible for a pharaoh to issue a decree for his courtiers to destroy the statues of the Egyptian gods that were in the temples, since the establishment of statues in the temples was a common practice during the dynastic period.
No. No, there were times when Egyptians did destroy statues. That's not quite true. Toppling of statues was actually not uncommon in Egypt, especially when you wanted to rebuild a temple. For example, Amenhotep III completely destroys the Temple of Luxor and then rebuilds the whole thing from scratch. So, Petrovich is wrong here. Anyone surprised?
So it probably doesn't refer to a mere commission of constructing new cult images, as that would likely have been the job of the devotees, as Emily Teeter noted. It better fits with the idea of religious turmoil in Egypt, when the pharaoh felt the need to enact judgment on the Egyptian gods.
Yeah, I don't agree with Teeter here. But then again, I don't agree with Teeter on a lot.
Douglas Petrovich also notes the high priest of Amun, someone named Mary, does not appear to have been given a successor under Amenhotep. This could be from a lack of text, but there doesn't appear to have been a high priest of Amun until much later.
So it could have been from the lack of texts, but we're just going to believe that it was because of religious turmoil. Yeah, okay.
Under Amenhotep III, and no tomb of Mary's successor has been found.
Tombs of a lot of important people haven't been found. That doesn't mean there wasn't a tomb.
There was also no high priest of Amun known under Amenhotep VI.
This is absence of evidence.
Successor, Thutmose IV, when he ordered the images of the Egyptian gods to be destroyed. Then we have secondary evidence, in that it may have been the case that the office of the high priest of Amun was not allowed to continue, and that the Aten cult.
You didn't establish that it wasn't allowed to continue. You just established there was no evidence of it continuing. That's different. That's not evidence. That's arguing from absence of evidence.
Which grew to become a counter-religious movement, seems to have its roots in this time period, suggesting that during the days of Amenhotep II, there was religious turmoil.
Yeah, there's no evidence for that.
However, This would be expected if there was an exodus.
Of course.
As Exodus 12:12 says, "On all the gods of Egypt I will execute judgment. I am the Lord." Egyptologists like James Hoffmeyer and Kenneth Kitchen note the plagues of Egypt were seen as attacks on the Egyptian gods by the God of Israel. If Egyptians perceived that their gods were defeated by another and that the gods failed to protect them from plagues, executing judgment on their statues and images would be a likely result.
It might be a result, but you wouldn't find the Egyptians doing that to their own statues. It's not that, well, the text does not say that the Egyptians were swayed from their beliefs in their gods. I think that's reading into the text too much. That too much doesn't follow.
Some Egyptians may have even looked for new religious ideas in a cult that would one day gain power under Akhenaten. Of course, when we read Exodus 12, it also mentions the 10th plague of Egypt, when God struck down all the firstborn. And also correlating with this point in Egyptian history, Amenhotep's oldest son did not inherit the throne, nor
a lot of oldest sons never inherited the throne. And that is because the, infant mortality rates were exceptionally high in Egypt. Very few firstborn children, there's a lot of firstborn children that did not make it to adulthood. That's just life in a Bronze Age society. And a lot of, this even happened to kings, a lot of the firstborns of kings did not make it to the throne. So that cannot be used as an identifying factor.
Or was he the oldest son of his father? Inscriptions that date to the 24th year of Thutmose III state someone known as Prince Amenemhat was the oldest son of Thutmose III. He obviously died before his father, and the throne passed to Amenhotep. However, Amenhotep's successor was also not his oldest son. The pharaoh that succeeded him was Thutmose IV. And there's a famous stele called the Dream Stele, which says that when Thutmose IV was a child, the sun god came to him and said he would get to rule Egypt if he would uncover the Sphinx. Egyptologists doubt the story, but they point out it was probably a piece of propaganda to explain why Thutmose IV became the pharaoh. If he was the oldest son, his reign would just have been expected, and he would not need an explanation for how it came to pass. So Egyptologists agree, Thutmose IV was probably not the oldest son of Amenhotep.
That is correct. He was probably not the oldest son of Amenhotep II. However, probably the reason for the Sphinx stela was the fact he was the son of a minor queen, which was a big, big deal in ancient Egypt.
Or the expected heir, which is why the Dream Stele had to be commissioned, to put divine providence behind his reign.
Probably.
However, if you do your homework, you'll find that there are some texts that attest to another Amenhotep, which Redford refers to as Prince B, or Prince Amenhotep. This prince was the son of Amenhotep II. Based on inscriptions from the Sphinx Temple, he would have most likely lived past Amenhotep's 9th year, and therefore past the Exodus. However, Prince B is also not referred to as the king's oldest son, which was a common practice for Egyptians to do. Egyptians also tried not to name their oldest the same as themselves, because they instituted something called co-regencies, meaning
no, that's not correct. The fact is that kings did name sons after themselves. It happened frequently. But it was also expected, too, that when a son of a king came to the throne, he would have a shortened name, as a birth name. And then that name would then be changed upon becoming co-regent. So it was entirely possible to have two kings of the same name, at least from an English perspective. But from an Egyptian perspective, they would look like completely different names. We find this all through, say, for example, the Middle Kingdom, through the 19th dynasty. This was not uncommon for kings to name their sons after themselves. But it would usually not be a full titulary or a long name, but it would usually be an abbreviated or short name. So an Amenhotep is the short name. So this is not true.
That when the pharaoh was getting old, he would appoint his son as a co-regent, so he could learn how to rule Egypt before his father died. So it could get quite confusing having two pharaohs with the same name.
No, it wouldn't. It would never be confusing. The Egyptians would never confuse that, even if they had the same sort of name. From, like, two Amenhoteps would not confuse the Egyptians, because there would be an extended titulary there. There would be a extended name. Like, for example, you would have, say, Ramses Meriamun or Ramses Setep and Re. And that would distinguish, say, two Ramses. In English, we just abbreviate that to Ramses. So for us, it's confusing. For the Egyptians, it wasn't.
Thus, it would be more likely that Amenhotep II would not name his oldest son Amenhotep as well. So Donald Redford, who doesn't believe an Exodus happened, says something strikingly peculiar about this. The fact that he was named Amenhotep like his father might be taken to indicate that he was not the firstborn, that an older son named Thutmose had been born to Amenephis II. It would be necessary to assume, however, that this Thutmose had passed away in childhood without leaving any trace. Now, some who are still skeptical at this point might want to ask, if there was an exodus of Semites who were the ancestors of the nation of Israel, where is the evidence of foreigners living in Egypt and suddenly leaving? The book of Exodus says the Hebrews set out from the city of Ramesses. We know where this site is thanks to archaeological excavations. However, during the days of the 18th dynasty, it is doubtful this site was called Ramesses.
It's doubtful,
but as we noted, updating place names in the Hebrew Bible was a standard practice.
Okay. The city of Ramses did not exist prior to King Seti I. It was built on an island. That island was not inhabited prior to Seti I. So, let's see where he goes with this.
And it is frequently employed in Genesis.
Again, he confuses redaction and retrojection.
Genesis, the land is called Ramesses, and most scholars accept this wasn't the name when Israel moved into the land of Goshen. So the city could have also been updated, and it wasn't necessarily the name when the Exodus occurred. Prior to that, the traditional name for the site was Avaris.
No. The traditional name of the site was not Avaris. Wrong. The city of Ramses was a virgin site when it was first occupied by Seti I. And it wasn't a city at the time of Seti I. It was just a royal residence on an island. That royal residence was then turned into the capital city by Ramses II. P. Ramses? Ramses II? Coincidence? No, it's not a coincidence. Avaris is 2 kilometers away from Paramses. Now, everyone accepts that Avaris was the site where the Israelites stayed. That was their home city, their city, and the former Hyksos capital. But it is not the same site as P-Ramses. Completely separate cities.
Manfred Bietak has led excavations on the site for years, and
Manfred Bietak has excavated at Avaris. He does not excavate at Kantir, which is the site of P-Ramses. Kantir is, right now, it's a city. Now, they've done CZ magnetometry surveys and ground penetrating radar surveys of Kontir, so we kind of know what's underneath the buildings. But it's still an occupied town today.
Is the leading expert on ancient Avaris. Occupation of the site goes back to the 11th dynasty, when the Hyksos...
Yeah, Jones here is confusing two sites. He's conflating two sites.
Took over, Avaris seems to have been their capital. When the 18th dynasty took over, they didn't abandon the site. Instead, they occupied it, forming a new royal citadel. They also used the site as a military base and harbor for launching campaigns into Canaan.
It was a harbor?
The city seems to have been transformed into an enormous store city for conquest into Canaan. And it was most likely used for this purpose under Thutmose III
I don't think you can make that
II.
statement.
Btek also notes that when the Hyksos were kicked out, there is no evidence of a mass exodus. There is mounting evidence that a large part of this population stayed on in Egypt and served their new overlords with their skills and experience, which were in demand in their host country. He notes Canaanite-style artifacts can be found at the site of Avaris during the New Kingdom.
That's true.
And from the Hyksos period on, there is an unbroken continuity right up to the Thut-mo-se period.
Oh, wait a minute. There was an unbroken continuity up until the Ramesside period. You're superimposing on the evidence here. No. It's not the Tut-mo-se period that there's an unbroken continuity. That continuity continues right until early Dynasty 19, when most of the city is abandoned. No, because we have, temples that are not just constructed by Thutmose kings, but also renovated and restored by Amarna kings. So it's still there during the Amarna period.
Pig bones found at this site. So the Semitic people who were there during the Hyksos period seem to have stayed there right up through part of the 18th dynasty. However, under the 18th dynasty, it doesn't appear the people were treated well. There is some evidence of ritual executions conducted on young males at the site. The site was also in use through the reign of Thutmose III, but there is no evidence of the site being occupied after the reign of Amenhotep II.
Baloney. Absolute baloney. There's actually a lot of evidence that the site was occupied after Amenhotep II. As I said, we find that the plinth, the Temple of Baal, inscribed by Horemheb. We find the year 400 stela there. There, and that's Seti the First. There's a lot of evidence of occupation after Amenhotep II. This is just complete nonsense. This is twisting the facts. No, this is baloney.
The Canaanite people who were there seem to have moved elsewhere or left. To quote Btek, it was in use from the early reign of Thutmose III until the reign of Amenephis II, perhaps even until the end of the king's reign. We hear nothing.
Now, particular separate areas of it were abandoned for a variety of reasons, particularly with the movement of the river. That's not the whole city. Btek said in another article that the city itself was not abandoned until early Dynasty 19.
Of Peru Nefer in the text after the reign of Amenhotep II, when the site was abandoned until the Amarna period.
Now, Peru Nefer, that is actually the name of the port. That's not the name of the city itself. So we have to be a little careful there, because Peru Nefer as the port survives into Dynasty 20. The Peru Nefer and the city of Avaris itself sort of have these, even though Peru Nefer is part of Avaris, it is not, say, the entire city itself.
Btek suggests it could have been abandoned at the end of Amenhotep's reign, or during it. However, Douglas Petrovich has argued the evidence at the site indicates it could not have been abandoned at the end of his reign, and was more likely abandoned somewhere in the middle.
Yeah, and he doesn't argue it well. When he gave that paper, B-Talk was actually sitting in the audience and sort of laughed at him.
This is due in part to a lack of scarab evidence for Thutmose IV. Remember that pharaohs...
And yet we find the titularies of Seti I, Ramses I, Horemheb, also at Avaris. That's kind of going to be a hard case to make.
Would institute co-regencies with their heir when they were beginning to approach death. If the site was still in use up until the end of Amenhotep's reign, we should expect to find some scarab evidence of Thutmose IV. The name of the harbor is also not included in text after Amenhotep II.
The name of the harbor continues till Dynasty 20. This is baloney.
Also, the site was mainly used for launching military operations into Canaan. And as we noted before, Thutmose IV...
that site was a major trading port. It was used to send goods all over the Mediterranean. It was the primary port that was used by the Hyksos to get rich. The Hyksos would plunder Egypt, put this stuff on the boats, and they would send it off all across the Mediterranean to trade. So it wasn't just a military port, it was also a general trade port.
Did launch minor policing operations into Canaan. So it's unlikely he would have abandoned the site when it would have been useful for him during his campaigns. And pottery found in some of the burial sites best correlates to the time of Thutmose III and Amenhotep II. So the site was most likely abandoned before Thutmose IV,
silly.
And would thus indicate it happened sometime during Amenhotep's reign, probably around the time when the peace treaty was signed with the Mitanni Empire and the campaigns into Canaan ceased, correlating with what we should expect to find if there was an exodus of Semites. The evidence shows that Semitic people, who were there since the Hyksos period, suddenly abandoned the site during the reign of Amenhotep II. Some might attempt to argue this could not be the exodus of the biblical Hebrews, because B-Tech also notes we have found evidence that the Canaanite population was worshipping an array of gods at the time of the occupation. But this is not inconsistent with the biblical report. In fact,
I'd agree with
we
that.
should expect to find this, because the book of Joshua explicitly says the Hebrews were worshipping other gods while in Egypt.
That's correct.
The Exodus, according to the biblical text, is one of the things that God used to bring Israel back to...
We have evidence from that area that the Semitic Asiatic population worshipped Baal, Resheph, and Astarte.
Worshipping only him, which was a process that took several generations to correct. So finding evidence of Canaanite polytheism at Avaris should be expected if the biblical account is accurate.
Yeah.
B-Tech
I'll agree with
also
that.
notes some additional, peculiar features of when Avaris was abandoned. One is that we're not sure why the site was abandoned, but the most likely explanation is because of a plague.
No. That's not a likely explanation that it was abandoned. In fact, you wouldn't find any Egyptologist that says it was because of a plague. The most common explanation for why Avaris was abandoned was because of the movement of the river. Now, I don't agree with that explanation. I don't think it was the movement of the river, because if it was the movement of the river, why would Peru-Nefer stay in operation until Dynasty 20? That doesn't make any sense. Okay, so I reject the common Egyptological explanation as to why it was abandoned. But saying it was plague, you're going to have to find a bit more evidence. Now, it could be that plagues were involved. I mean, I accept that there were plagues that caused the abandonment of Avaris. Pinpointing that to the reign of Amenhotep II's gonna be tough.
A plague, such as the one documented for Avaris in the late Middle Kingdom, and associated with Avaris in later traditions, appears to be the most likely solution to this problem, although it cannot be proven at this time.
Yep, that's what I said.
The plagues inflicted upon Egypt, as recorded by the Book of Exodus, were a combination of various natural disasters, most of which would not leave behind any evidence. There are reasonable explanations for how some of these could have played out. Like, for example, the darkness could have been caused by a volcanic eruption from nearby Arabia. But such a thing would be hard to prove.
Wait. Volcanic eruption from Arabia? Are you serious? Oh my gosh. Are you kidding me? Nearby eruption from Arabia. Good grief.
Nile turning to blood could have been caused by an algae bloom in a Nile estuary. That could have triggered a chain reaction, causing species like frogs to come out of the river. That's not what they meant
by turning the river to blood.
And resulting in the death of fish and amphibians, bringing things like flies and disease.
Possible.
The only indication
difficult to prove.
of something like this happening is in the Ipuwer papyrus. Most scholars date it to an earlier time period, but it does speak of the Nile turning to blood, which could have been a natural event that happened again during the Exodus.
The Ipuwer papyrus dates to the 12th dynasty. You won't find any Egyptologists that disagree with that.
Kitchen suggests Ipuwer in the Exodus account could be referring to the same type of natural disaster.
Possible.
More recently, Titus Kennedy has made a case the linguistic evidence of Ipuwer dates to the time period of the 18th dynasty.
No, because there's a king date. I mean, it fills, the whole Middle Kingdom, early Dynasty 12 political genre. The grammar is completely consistent with Middle Kingdom, syntax, grammar, that sort of thing. The orthography is all Middle Kingdom. No, I don't see this as being viable. I think this is wishful thinking.
It could be a poetic account of the plagues of the Exodus. In the same way Psalm 78 and 105 are poetic accounts of the Exodus.
Yeah, definitely wishful thinking.
But because of the poetic nature of Ipuwer, it is hard to really nail down a definitive answer on the nature of the text. But there is some evidence it linguistically can fit with the same time period of the Exodus. But of course, it would be difficult to find hard evidence for the plagues, because they would not have made an archaeological...
The language of ancient Egypt goes through several phases. It goes through a Middle Egyptian phase. First of all, it goes through an Old Egyptian phase, a Middle Egyptian phase, and then a late Egyptian phase, and then there's some other phases that go after that. But for the sake of our discussion here, it's the Middle Egyptian and the late Egyptian that are really important. And the syntax and the orthography of Middle Kingdom, Middle Egyptian is very, very different than from texts we find in the New Kingdom or what's called Late Egyptian. And the transition between Middle Egyptian and Late Egyptian occurs at the end of, say, Dynasty 17. So just as the reign of the Hyksos is ending, we see this transition in language. And the fact is that Ipuwer is classic Middle Egyptian. It's definitely a lot older than Dynasty 18. You're just gonna. That's an uphill battle to prove that Ipuwer was written in Dynasty 18. I don't think you can make that case. It's just silly.
Logical mark that would have lasted for several millennia. In Egypt, rarely admitted embarrassments or defeats. However, a more interesting find at Avaris is that there was a large grave of young sheep and goats, also known as lambs, that dates to the time of the abandonment or shortly after.
There could be a lot of reasons for goat and lamb burials. We find all sorts of animals buried at Avaris, and from various time periods too. Again, this is not conclusive of anything.
Even more peculiar is Dje-hoo-ty notes the lambs died young, most only about 1 year old, and were buried with care, which is what we should expect to find if there was a Passover ritual that utilized the blood of lambs.
Okay. If you are having the Passover and you're commanded to eat the entire lamb, you are not going to find fully articulated lamb skeletons in a grave. You're going to find lamb bones, piles of bones, because that's what you have to do to eat the lamb. The instruction for the Passover was to sacrifice the lamb and then eat the lamb, all of it. And anything you couldn't eat, you had to burn. You're not going to find skeletons buried as if they were whole animals in that period. It just, if that was the command of the Passover, this is not the Passover lambs, because you wouldn't find them as complete skeletons. It's just, with the head attached to the neck, attached to the ribs, attached to the feet. It's just, read the text, people. You're supposed to eat the whole thing.
God told Israel to utilize young lambs in their first year for the Passover, and then to care for the carcasses so as to not break any bones. And surprisingly, we find graves that match this description.
But you are supposed to eat the lambs. These are showing skeletons buried as if they've been either, reconstructed, which is they didn't do, or they were buried as whole animals. I think a lot more likely situation is that these particular lambs died prematurely of some disease. I think that's a much more plausible explanation. Again, I'm not denying a Passover or a real Passover or a real Exodus here, but I am saying that what is being found in this context cannot be the Exodus or the Passover.
Inscription that dates to the time of the abandonment of Avaris. Thus, it seems probable we have found evidence of the first Passover.
No.
Dje-hoo-ty says, it seems highly unusual that shepherds would bury the often tiny animals with such care in deep pits, rather than leaving the corpses.
People cared for their animals, even back then. This is not unusual. You had a lamb, that was your family's livelihood. That's the next generation. If you lose all your lambs and you bury them, you're not going to just treat them badly. It's kind of silly.
As prey for dogs or birds, or just throwing them into the river, the common practice in Egypt to this day. Why the bodies were disposed of so carefully cannot easily be explained. The reason surely was not only out of hygienic considerations. The animals, both young and adult, were as a rule bedded down with care, not simply thrown into the pits. The shepherds obviously not only cared for their livestock, but also for their dead animals. Dje-hoo-ty goes on to note, the likely candidates as to who performed these animal burials were Asiatic nomadic shepherds from Sinai or beyond. In other words, they probably were the same Canaanite people who lived there during the Hyksos period and remained during the 18th dynasty, until they abandoned the site during the reign of Amenhotep II. There is also some evidence that Asiatics, who were responsible for the introduction of wool sheep from Asia into Egypt during the Middle Kingdom, were still employed as shepherds during the New Kingdom. We may therefore assume that the shepherds tending the Egyptian institutionalized herds of small livestock in the Eastern Delta also may have originated among the culturally elusive nomads living on the eastern fringes of the Delta. They may have been the Shashu, a people known from the Egyptian texts from the 18th dynasty onward. But what is interesting is in a later inscription, Egyptians associated the Shashu with the god Yahweh. Archaeologist Titus Kennedy recently went to investigate an Egyptian temple.
Okay, yes. There is evidence to suggest that Yahweh was the patron god of the Shasu. And this is something I'm actually going to do a full video on later on.
In northern Sudan. An inscription that dates to around 40 to 50 years after this event refers to the Shashu of Yahweh dwelling in the desert. Kennedy notes there's no land determinative, and therefore Yahweh is probably a personal name, not a place name. And so the Shashu of Yahweh might be the first reference to Israel during their wandering period.
No. No, I do not think the Shasu and the Israelites are the same thing. I think that's kind of no. No, I don't think that's viable.
So the burial of lambs and sheep at Avaris has similarities to the Shashu and might be a cultural connection. Even without this last possible connection, what we have at the site of Avaris lines up extremely well with what the Book of Exodus records. The people who abandoned Avaris under Amenhotep II are very likely to be the Hebrews of the Exodus, as well as seeking retaliation against the Egyptian gods, military and political weakening, and there are other correlations from the reign of Amenhotep that align with the Exodus.
One big mess of
the external evidence
bias
we should expect to find, if there was an historical Exodus, all seems to exist, and surprisingly, it all converges to a period under the reign of Amenhotep II. Now, some skeptics might suggest that these events do not necessarily prove an Exodus, and alternative explanations could be proposed. Perhaps there really was no peace treaty, or perhaps Amenhotep's willingness to sign the treaty was a result of something else, and the religious turmoil may have happened later during his reign and was unrelated, and perhaps his oldest son just died of natural causes. Why connect all of this with an Exodus event? Well, for one, we have a textual account handed down to us that binds all of this circumstantial evidence together, the Book of Exodus. If the account of the Exodus did not exist, you could argue there's no reason to connect.
The Book of Evidence binds all that to a Ramesside period. The period of the city of Ramses, Pithom, Migdol. These are all geographic markers that have a Ramesside context. So the Book of Exodus just on its own would not get you that conclusion.
Connect all this together. However, we were able to explain why the account of the Exodus exists, along with all these anomalies from the reign of Amenhotep II, which correspond to when the Bible says the Exodus took place. So we can account for all this data with one explanation, instead of several different explanations that lack textual data. So Occam's razor can be invoked to argue the Exodus theory is less ad hoc than alternative theories that try to...
All right. I think this is an abuse of Occam's razor. I mean, Occam's razor says you presented with the evidence, you take the most likely, the simplest conclusion. But Jones here hasn't presented evidence. He's presented conjecture. That's not evidence. Historians don't accept that as evidence. Conjecture is an evidence.
Explain these anomalies with a collection of different explanations. And again, this explanation can also account for why the Book of the Exodus was written. It goes back to an historical event, and we can find where it lines up in the Egyptian record. But if this is true, then there should be some internal evidence in the Pentateuch that shows it came from a group that originated in Egypt, demonstrating that the account of Exodus goes back to an historical people group from that time period. Well, in fact, several biblical scholars have noted there are several internal clues that show the Book of Exodus doesn't bear the markers of later forgers, but contains several internal indicators that shows the account goes back to an historical people group who have knowledge of the Egyptian language, customs, and the culture.
I would agree with that.
Benjamin Noonan notes the language used in the Book of Exodus to Numbers contains a significant amount of Egyptian loanwords. There are a total of 27, and a total of 381 different occurrences. Specifically, the Book of Exodus contains 26 loanwords and 333 occurrences. Outside of these 3 books, and within the rest of the Hebrew Bible, there are only 51 Egyptian loanwords and 450 occurrences, for a much larger section of the Bible. Given the ratio of
Agreed.
distribution, there is a much smaller proportion of Egyptian loanwords in the rest of the corpus, when compared to the books that would be expected to have more affinity with an Egyptian past. Noonan says, when one compares the above data, it becomes evident that the Exodus and
Like that
wilderness
book.
traditions
Great book.
contain a
I'm published in that
significantly
book.
higher proportion of Egyptian loanwords than the rest of the Hebrew Bible. From the standpoint of contact linguistics, this observation indicates that the Exodus and wilderness narratives, especially the narratives of the Book of Exodus, exhibit greater Egyptian influence than the remainder of the Hebrew Bible. Thus, the high amount of Egyptian loanwords in the Exodus narrative is unique with regards to regional languages within the Levant.
I have no argument with
The
that.
question, of course, is how and
No problem
when
with that.
did the Egyptian influence occur on the Hebrew language? Noonan argues based on the type of some of the loanwords we find in the Book of Exodus, the likely time for linguistic borrowing to occur would be during the Middle to Late Bronze Age. Some of the loanwords in Hebrew are feminine nouns that contain a specific ending, yet this ending dropped off in later times in Egypt. So the most likely time for this influence to
Bronze Age actually goes a lot further than that. So,
occur is during the Bronze Age,
the problem with his
when the
graphic
Bible
here,
says the Hebrews were in Egypt. Thus, the Exodus narrative contains remnants of the Egyptian language of the Bronze Age, or the period of the Middle Kingdom to New Kingdom. James Hoffmeyer notes many of the personal names of the Pentateuch reflect the same time period of Egypt, and most likely have Egyptian roots. The name Moses is most likely a Hebrewized version of the Egyptian name that shows up in names like Thutmose or Ramesses.
Okay, Hoffmeyer likes this hypothesis. A lot of Egyptologists like this hypothesis that Moses was derived from the word mess. The problem here is that mess Moses is actually Moshe. It uses a sheen, not a samic. So I think that this is problematic. I think the best solution to the Moses problem was actually proposed by Thomas Schneider, who basically pointed out that there are actually a lot of names in Egyptian that are derived from like Amen Emshe, Amen of the lake, as sort of a ritualized name. So Schneider conjectured that Moses is actually from Emshe. So while a lot of Egyptologists think that it comes from Messis, I think Schneider's explanation of this is much better.
Meyer suspects there's bilingual wordplay happening in the Book of Exodus, prescribing meaning to his name in chapter 2. Merari, son of Levi, is only attested among Hebrew names in the Semitic world, but was a common Egyptian name of the Middle Kingdom. Phineas is also most likely an Egyptian name that means Nubian. The name Asir might derive from the god Osiris. Several other names have Egyptian roots. Now, Richard Hess notes many names could instead potentially have West Semitic origin. However, West Semitic names have a strong presence in Egyptian texts from the New Kingdom. Hess also notes the names still reflect an early origin. All of these names have roots attested in the 2nd millennium BC. There is no personal name that appears only in the 1st millennium BC, and thus there is none that can be used to support the argument for the narratives being a fictional account written by scribes in the middle of the 1st millennium BC. By itself, this is a significant finding, for it affirms the names as appropriate to the time when the events of the Exodus and the surrounding narratives took place. It would be remarkable if scribes writing much later had not placed among 40 names some that were unique to their later period, and not attested in the 2nd millennium BC. Another piece of data suggests a late Bronze Age origin for the account of the Exodus. The use of the name Ramesses for the city and the land of Goshen are probably updated names by the time Israel settled in Canaan.
Yeah, I'm skeptical about that.
But by the 11th century BC, P. Ramesses was dismantled and the stones were moved to the new capital Tanis. The city was abandoned and Ramesses doesn't show up in later sources to refer to Tanis. So scholars note the Exodus narrative seems to have been set and finalized, at least as an oral tradition, before the dismantling of Ramesses.
Well, that should rub some people the wrong way. He's suggesting here the use of redaction to update the names. I'm not convinced by the redaction theory of the Exodus texts. I think that's slippery ground. As a Bible-believing Christian, that would not make me very happy.
This is not to say the book of Exodus originally had the word Avaris and was later changed, but that when the Hebrews began to preserve their history centuries later, they referred to the site by its current name, which at that time would have been Ramesses, which would indicate when the account of the Exodus began being written down or orally.
But if this is what he's saying, that the Israelites left during the reign of Amenhotep II, then Avaris would have still been around at the time that Jones has proposed the writing of. That doesn't make a lot of sense.
Finalized. Furthermore, later texts like Psalm 78 refer to the area by the first millennium BC name, the field of Zoan. The book of Exodus does not use.
Yeah, again, this Zoan is a kind of retrojection. It is not a redaction. Zoan is using what is common in the vernacular of the moment. Now, again, I do admit that it is possible that all the names in the book of Exodus were retrojected. However, that is very, very difficult to maintain once you start looking at the fact that some of these cities did not exist at all at the time of Amenhotep II. So it's very hard to retroject something to a place that the Israelites were said to have gone that wasn't there. So there's limits to how much one can claim retrojection. The problem, I think, with Jones here, though, is not so much that he's claiming an argument of retrojection, he's claiming an argument of redaction, and I think that's problematic.
Use this later name. Manfred Bietek says, this shows that the presence of the toponym Ramesses in the books of Genesis and Exodus must have been adopted from a tradition older than the Third Intermediate and Saite periods. The said changes in the physical and political landscape of the Eastern Delta, including new major centers and toponyms, were incorporated only later into the Bible, while the start of the itinerary in Exodus reflects the topographical conditions of the Ramesside period.
Yes.
So Exodus retained an older name, supporting the case the account of the Exodus goes back to memories from the second millennium. Hofmeyr also notes other toponyms can date back to the New Kingdom period time. We also see customs and cultural connections throughout the Pentateuch. Exodus 15, also called the Song of the Sea, is
Okay. Hofmeyr goes a little farther than that these toponyms not just date to dynasty, to the New Kingdom. He's basically saying that they date to the 19th dynasty. So that's a little more specific here. But that wouldn't play nice with Jones's view of an Amenhotep II Exodus.
Finally, we can add another piece of data. By looking beyond the Pentateuch, we can find separate traditions that agree Israel was once in Egypt and left due to plagues and disease. Both the Roman historian Tacitus and the Egyptian historian Manetho speak of the Jews leaving Egypt a long time ago.
Oh, brother. This is... One of the problems with using Manetho is that the copy that is often cited of Manetho here was preserved in Josephus. And Josephus always dickers with some things to make the Jews seem more antiquated than the Greeks. This was just what Josephus did. So we can't be sure that the reference to the Israelites in Manetho is from Manetho and not from Josephus. That's problematic.
Although Josephus disagrees with him, and he seems to date the Exodus at a later time, he does say the pharaoh of the Exodus was someone named Amenephis, which is the Greek name for Amenhotep. But if Amenhotep was the pharaoh of the Exodus, why did he not die in the Red Sea?
But which Amenephis? There's many of them.
Well, it is a common belief today that the pharaoh drowned, but the Bible doesn't actually claim this. Douglas Petrovich says, Moses only states that the Lord would be honored through Pharaoh by the destruction of his army. But throughout the entire narrative of Exodus, Moses never explicitly states that Pharaoh died along with his army.
That's correct.
He also notes the later Psalm 136 is often used to support the notion the Pharaoh drowned in the Red Sea, but it is vague in the original Hebrew. It doesn't say the Pharaoh specifically drowned, and besides that, we're speaking of a text that was meant to be more poetic in nature. The Hebrew verb shows that God actually shook off the powerful Pharaoh and his army, who were bothersome pests that God, whose might is far greater than theirs, merely brushed away. So there is no indication in the biblical text that Pharaoh died during the Exodus. Amenhotep II probably sent his army across the Red Sea without going himself. Another objection is the Exodus, if taken entirely literally, would indicate the amount of Hebrews who left Egypt, and the mixed multitude who went with them, was somewhere between 2 and 5 million. This is incredibly high and unlikely. If there was that many slaves in Egypt, they could have just taken over themselves, similar to what happened with the Hyksos. But scholars have noted for years this is not actually what the Bible says. Richard Hess and Kenneth Kitchen, as well as many conservative scholars, agree the Hebrew term for 1,000 can refer to a military unit, a tribe, or a small group.
That's a common interpretation among scholars.
Mitchell Modine also notes the census data in the Book of Numbers bears the marks of idealized figures, not the literal numbers of the actual census. And we have noted elsewhere using idealized numbers as a common Jewish theme. More realistic estimates put the Exodus at between 15,000 and 30,000 people, which fits more.
Okay. I know most scholars today put it in the number of people who have left during the Exodus in the sort of 5-figure range. But I think based upon, say, Semitic demographics from the Middle Kingdom, one could make a case that it was in the 6 figures.
With the expected birth rates and numbers we see in the later Book of Judges. Many skeptics also attempt to argue that if the Exodus happened, there should be a written record of it in Egypt. After all, we have found thousands of inscriptions throughout Egypt.
Yeah, but very little historical records. What we find is religious texts that have some historicity to them. That's not the same as a historical record. So we got to be very, very cautious. I mean, even some of the more historical texts, like the Annals of Thutmosis III, we have to remember that these were written on the walls of temples. That's how they survived. Because they were written on the walls of temples, they were written with a religious angle in mind, so anything that negative at all that would have happened would have been taken out. Because you just don't want your failures repeated to the gods through all eternity. That's a bad thing.
Surely if there was an Exodus, someone would have at least mentioned it once. But this can be addressed by simply studying the cultural and archaeological context. First, the Egyptians were not trying to write unbiased history. In their inscriptions, they were trying to promote a glorified version of themselves and their actions. Jenny Hill says, the hieroglyphic inscriptions on the walls of their temples were a useful propaganda tool of the pharaoh and the priests.
Yeah, it's not so much about propaganda, it's more about devotion. It's more about giving the gods what they want. You know, you give the gods glory by presenting them with the great deeds they've done. You know, Israelite religion does the same thing. You know, this is why we put the Israelites put the piece of Aaron's rod in front of the ark. This is why they put the jar of manna. This is praising God with the deeds of God. Conquests in Egypt were the same thing. They were praising their gods with what they ascribed as the deeds of their gods.
James Hoffmeyer notes, the reality is that pharaohs typically do not report on failures, or they turn them propagandistically into successes.
I don't like the term propaganda here. I think that the term is a bit anachronistic. I think it also doesn't demonstrate sort of the reality of Egyptian religion. So, I think propaganda has more of a political connotation that I don't think was an issue in ancient Egypt. The fact is that the ancient Egyptians didn't have political rivals. It was a military dictatorship. There was no contest to their power once they assumed the throne. So the need for political propaganda was not there. What you did need, though, was you did need the support of your gods, just like everybody in the ancient Near East did.
Egyptologists extract bits of historical information from ancient Egyptian inscriptions, but with the understanding that the Egyptians were not at all trying to be fair, let alone record events that would have gone against their agenda. So we aren't going to find in their inscriptions an account of when their slaves managed to best them and escape into the desert while drowning an Egyptian army. Also, it should be pointed out,
and even if you did, where would you find this located? You'd probably find it located on a day roll at the city of Pi-Ramses. How many texts have we found from Pi-Ramses? About 0.
Periods we know a lot about are fragmented. We know a lot about Thutmosis III because he went on several campaigns and left a lot of inscriptions boasting of his accomplishments. But we know less about his grandson, Thutmosis IV, because as Peter Clayton says, our knowledge is marred by a lack of texts.
Part of the thing is we have a lot of texts from Thutmosis III because he built a lot, he lived a long time, and he built his monuments at Karnak. And we do have that benefit that a lot of stuff at Karnak did survive. Thutmosis IV also had monuments at Karnak that did survive. We do know a little more about Thutmosis IV than probably is taken for granted. However, like for example, we do know that Thutmosis IV did have several campaigns into both Kush and Levant. So there was still a freestanding, apparently a capable army during the time of Thutmosis IV. We just don't have dates for those campaigns. We do have evidence of those campaigns, but just not dates.
Ancient Egyptian history is highly fragmented and riddled with bias. We shouldn't expect to find an inscription referencing the Exodus. And even on the tiny possibility that one did exist, it would likely have been lost with the mounds of evidence we are currently missing. But despite that, it can easily be argued, as I've done here, that there is an exorbitant amount of evidence that supports there was an exodus from Egypt. Within the archaeological record,
Yeah, I don't think you've made a very good case that you have lots of evidence there.
Evidence of foreign Semitic slaves around a site that was known later as Ramesses. The site was suddenly abandoned, and they left behind a large grave of lambs. We see evidence the pharaoh needed to replace them with a new workforce and obtain new chariots. We see this followed by a decline in Egyptian power and military might, as well as religious turmoil. Evidence shows a drastic change in the pharaoh's character, and whoever succeeded him could not have been his oldest son. We also see there is a wealth of internal evidence demonstrating the Book of Exodus has affinity to Egypt in the 2nd millennium BC, instead of resembling a 1st millennium BC text that fits with the Babylonian or Persian periods. Therefore, we have an abundance of evidence to support the Exodus account. The Exodus from Egypt is not a myth. It has been discovered right when the Bible says it happened.
Okay, I think that's probably the end of the video. Okay, so here are my concluding thoughts. I don't think Michael Jones makes his case. I think that he doesn't actually present evidence. I think he presents a lot of supposition. I think he has a lot of conjecture, a lot of confirmation bias. I just don't think what he showed here is good evidence. Now, I'm not saying there isn't good evidence for an Exodus. It's just not what he's showing. It's clear that he's been very, very influenced by an early Exodus date, and he's trying to find evidence to support that view. That's just not how historians work. Historians look at what is the evidence and what the evidence tells us. And if the evidence tells us something else, we go with that. We don't start with our theory and then try to find evidence to support that theory. The theory is supposed to come out of the evidence, not the evidence out of the theory. The production values of this, like everything Jones does, is high. It's, very, very slick video. It's a typical inspiring philosophy video. But I think the archaeology here is exceptionally deficient. And I don't use that lightly. There's things he says that are just, really out in left field. His discussion that the Hyksos that the Egyptians feared the return of the Hyksos is just crazy talk. There was no fear. That was never even a consideration of Dynasty 18. They had completely routed the Hyksos by the reign of Akhenaten I. By the end of the reign of Akhenaten I, there was no possibility that was ever going to happen again. And I think it's better explained by other evidence. The other thing is, he keeps talking about the Exodus being a historical document, and at the same time he ignores a lot of the historical references that are in the Exodus account. The whole toponym thing. Those toponyms are dateable. Even he admits that they're dateable. And yet he just ignores that, preferring an idea of redaction. And I think that's really, really problematic. I wouldn't recommend this as a solid production. It's not good archaeologically. It's not good. He doesn't reference the best scholarship. He uses Redford a lot, and it's a very dated book. He uses Petrovich a lot, which always has problems because Petrovich's scholarship is not up to par. I think that this was I know Jones threw a lot of money into this, but I think, just because you throw a lot of money into something doesn't mean you get a good result. And I think that's what we have here. So anyway, those are my thoughts on the Exodus Rediscovered, the film produced by Michael Jones. Thank you very much for watching this review video, and I will see you next time on Ancient Egypt and the Bible.